Hi, welcome to session one of the third topic of the semester. So, in this session, we're initiating a new topic that is going to look at this period of time that we have been examining ever since we started the course. The first historical period deals with building modern America. And so far, we have seen in the first topic and second topics certain aspects of the building of modern America. For example, the idea of progress we examined quite thoroughly in the science, technology, for example, during this transition towards modernity. We examined also capitalism and, of course, evolutionary theory and how people began to use it again to try to organize society in a way that it will achieve the end goal of evolution, the ideal societies again. So we looked at that in the first topic, and in the second topic, we examined the social transformations, particularly the social transformations that were taking place in the latter part of the 19th century as the country was modernizing. It was moving towards modernity, a modern industrial society, modern industrial economy. And so we were looking at tracking those changes as they occurred in the Northeast and Midwest, the northern region, if you will, of the country. We also looked at the South, the Old South, if you will, and looking at those social transformations taking place in that region. And also we looked at the West, the transformation of the Wild West into, a West that will be modernized and developed. Again, so we looked at that very thoroughly. So we covered those two topics, and now we're moving into the third one. And we're starting the third topic of the semester here. And the title of this topic is called In Search of New Frontiers, because by the end of the 19th century, what's going to happen is that territorial expansion, again, had come to an end by 1890. That is to say, as we'll see, there was no more land to the west to settle, to develop, in other words, because Americans had already moved from coast to coast, all the way to the Pacific coast, the west coast, that is to say. So by 1890, there was no more land moving westward because there's the ocean again. So the process of settlement or settling the continental landmass of the United States had come to a close. And so from this time, we're going to see about 1890, again, thereabouts, onwards, what we're going to see is that Americans began to search new frontiers, that is to say, new horizons, new lands outside of the mainland continental US, and they're looking for new frontiers for new commercial opportunities, particularly commercial opportunities. So they were now moving outward. That is to say, there's going to be a moving of of Americans out of the country, if you will, trying to search for those opportunities overseas. So this is a process that spanned, roughly speaking, in the latter part of the 19th century, the searching of those new frontiers, all the way to, we're going to be looking again the 1910s, 1920s. Again, we're going to actually stop there because in the following historical period, we're going to look at another aspect of U.S. history. It's called the crisis of modernity. We're going to look also at three topics dealing with the early 20th century. So in this topic, we're not going to move very far into the 20th century, just the latter part of the 19th century and very early part of the 20th, by the way. So let me share the the outline here. Okay, so here are the outlines. This is the grand title. This is the title of this new topic, In Search of New Frontiers. This is the third topic of the semester that looks at this first historical period again that I just described in the beginning. Again, it's called Building Modern America, if you will. And so this is the third topic. In Search of New Frontiers, roughly speaking, again, the timeline is between 1890 and the 1920s, although we're not really going to go beyond 1920. Actually, again, it's going to be, again, roughly speaking, about 30-year period or so, give and take. So we're actually just in this session, in this very first session, just going over, if you will, the process by which Americans began to look outwards. That is to say, what were the reasons, in other words, why we're going to see Americans actually searching for new frontiers abroad, overseas, in what parts of the world they were interested, and so on. What were the motivations? What were the ideals, if you will, that they had in mind as they began to look elsewhere, if you will, for opportunities. And so this is what we're going to be doing here, particularly in this very first session. All right, so at any rate, this is the title, and please mark this in your notes. Again, this is a whole new topic, shouldn't be mixed with the previous topics that we just covered. And again, there will be 2 or 3 sessions, again, done on this topic particularly, okay? So at any rate, so let's now move forward in this topic called In Search of New Frontiers. And to begin with, as I mentioned, there will be a trend in the latter part of the 19th century. Roughly speaking, we're talking about the last decades, the last 2 decades, but most intensely in the 1890s. In that the general sense, the general feeling, one of the feelings, one of the senses, again, that Americans had during this time was one of moving outward. That is to say, it's called expanding, if you will. Okay, it's called expansionism, if you will, in the 1890s. And one of the reasons for that had to do with, I said, here indicate number one, that in 1890, the frontier was declared officially closed in the United States. So what does this mean? Okay, so what is the frontier? What do we refer, in this case as the frontier? Well, the frontier in American history has been the kind of horizon, the dividing line between the land that had been settled by, let's say, going back to the colonial period when the first English settlers arrived. Okay, whether there were Puritans moving in New England or there were English settlers moving in places like Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and the South. So the frontier was always referred as this dividing line between the lands that were already settled by the English settlers, that they came with, the idea of developing, enterprises, plantations, or ranches, or farms, you name it. And they had created their own communities. And the dividing line was between the land that was settled in the east section of the continental landmass of the United States that was already settled, and also the land to the west that had not been settled, that had not been developed, in which there were, of course, other groups living in there, Native Americans in this case. Okay, so there were, of course, a great number of Native American groups, and very diverse, each with their own distinct language, tribal organization, and so on. Um, and there were many different types of survival strategies that they used. Some of them were farmers, some of them were hunters and gatherers, or a mix of those, and so on. So that was the frontier. To refer back during that time in the colonial period, the frontier, that was the edge, if you will, of civilization. And to cross the frontier was to go into this unknown territory, uncharted, for the most part. But it was, in a certain sense, kind of promising, because if you move into the frontier, well, there might be some opportunities for you waiting for you there. That is, if you wanted land, if you wanted to engage in trade, etc. Because what happened is that in different points of colonial history, just going back to colonial history, again, the 1600s and most of the 1700s, the fact is that in many cases the colonies will grow in population to the point that resources became very, very restricted. Land was restricted. Even opportunities, economic opportunities were restricted. They were overcrowded. Most of those cities, most of those towns, and of course, the idea is, well, we need to actually move westward, in search for those new opportunities, cross the frontier, if you will, move west, and the opportunities are going to be there. Okay, so there was always that thought. There was always this pattern, if you will, that yes, there's the frontier there in the West, but to be a pioneer, to cross it, might be something that will benefit, that will render some benefits in the end. So you have to be very adventurous, by the way. Not anybody just wanted to leave their communities, their towns, and search for those opportunities by crossing this frontier into an unknown territory. That is to say, so this is again a pattern. Again, in the colonial period, there are people crossing the frontier. There's people that are moving. They're moving westward, and that is the pattern. Of course, in the colonial period, the colonies were growing very slowly, if you will, but the colonies were growing in population, and they were also expanding territorially very gradually ever since the first settlers arrived, once again, in the early 1600s to the eastern seaboard. And so this is what we refer as the frontier. Okay, so now, as we progress in history, and now we move into nationhood, there's going to be a revolution, an independence process in 1776. Independence finally recognized in 1783. Okay, and we're going to see the formation of the United States and the American Republic finally in 1787. And so once the American Republic was formed, we're going to see also, again, a process by which Americans were also moving westward, okay, if you will. And now, again, we're talking about Americans, no longer colonists, but Americans are also moving westward. They're moving into the Great Lakes region, those northwestern territories, as they were called. And in the South, people are also trying to clear more land and move into the Western territories as well. Okay. So there is territorial growth. Once we see the beginning of the American Republic, the independent nation state, and there's going to be more and more people pushing the frontier over. And it is here, as we move into the 1800s, that there was a certain religious zeal, if you will, in the atmosphere among many Americans, in that they saw moving westward as a sort of divine mandate. In other words, that this is the promise or mission that God has given to us. He has promised, land. So the promised land, in other words, is to the west. This is part of our destiny. This is our divine destiny. In other words, this is something that God has a plan for the United States. And one of those plans is to expand from coast to coast, that is to say. So again, there was a kind of like a religious, fervor again to the idea of moving westward, that it was not just that the practical thing of just moving there for seizing commercial opportunities, like land and trade and so on, but rather that Americans felt that this was part of God's plan, that God had a plan for the United States, that God had a plan for the United States as to be one of the most important nations in the world, okay? A beacon of light, okay, that will shine, of course, throughout the world and so on because of the, exceptional values and so on and so forth, like democracy, for example, okay, and liberty and so on. But it was essential that the country move all the way to the west in order to become an entire continental landmass, all settled and all together. All the people that will occupy the lands from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast will become a great nation, that is to say. This idea was referred back in the 1830s, particularly around those decades, as manifest destiny. Okay, manifest destiny. So again, by the 1820s, by the 1830s, what we're going to see is that many Americans began to look at this movement as this migration to the Western lands in a religious kind of mission, as a religious mission, that is to say, not just driven by economics, but also driven by religion, that is to say, that it was the destiny, in other words, the manifest destiny, was the destiny that it was already manifest by God, that God had a plan, for the future of nations. For every nation, there's a plan. But particularly for the United States, there's a special plan to move from coast to coast, from the East Coast to all the way to the West Coast. That this was destiny. Okay, this is the destiny of the United States to move. The destiny of Americans is to cross the frontier and to push the boundary of the frontier all the way to the West Coast and develop all of the land across again the continental United States. So again, by the 1820s, by the 1830s, we're going to see massive outpourings of people moving westward, by the way. And more people are going to be moving westward in the 1800s than in the previous centuries combined. So consider, for example, that the first settlers began arriving to Virginia as early as 1609 or thereabouts. And the Puritans began arriving to New England in 1620, and then more in 1630. And ever since, they're establishing their communities and trying to move westward slowly but surely. But despite the fact that there's plenty of immigration coming from Europe, in the 16 and 1700s, and the colonies were growing, the fact is that this territorial expansion was quite slow compared to the kind of migrations and territorial expansion that will take place in the 1800s. In the 1800s, we're going to see the frontier, being pushed every single year further and further to the west, to the point that by 1890, Americans had already settled all of the lands between the east and the west coast. There was no more way to go, that is to say. So part of that had to do with this religious seal that I just mentioned, again, called manifest destiny. But another thing is, of course, that there's population growth in the United States. There is an industrial revolution taking place. So there's, of course, the growth of cities, the growth of towns, the need for more land for farming to sustain the peoples of the cities. So there was the need also to acquire that land in the West, of course. There is the cotton boom. Industries require cotton, so southern planters are also trying to send as many people over to the West to clear land to create more plantations, of course. So the Industrial Revolution was a critical factor in this, in trying to kind of push the frontier further and further all the way to the West. So that's a fact in the 1800s. That's another critical factor. And of course, the coming of the railroad. The railroad also paved the road for the faster movement of people from the eastern states all the way to the western territories. Because now there's a means of transportation that was not available before. That is the railroad. So now you can move more people. You can move already, also resources back and forth. You can create enterprises in the western territories and again, link the country together commercially, something we already saw, of course, in the second topic. So, yes, so there are other factors other than just people, seeing their migrations as a kind of religious mission. It's true. So there's technology, there's industrialization, there's a commercial economy that is also pushing people. Population booms, more people need land again, so they're going to cross over in the frontier moving westward. So so there's a multiplicity of factors, but this is going to be important, this idea of manifest destiny, because this idea of manifest destiny is going to remain pretty much part of the American cultural framework as to how Americans see themselves again in relationship with, let's say, other nations, for example. Okay, so when Americans are going to be searching for new frontiers, as we'll see after 1890, moving outside, manifest destiny again is going to play a key role in how they're going to see themselves moving into other countries. As to, well, we do have a mission, for example, okay, a divine mission, if you will, to go on in other regions and spread American values, etc., etc. Again, so manifest destiny kind of began shaping, how the psychological, if you will, framework of Americans that were moving into the frontier in ways that people are going to begin interpreting their migrations as a kind of pilgrimage or mission, that they had a divine mission, in other words, to move to the frontier and transform the societies that they were going into. So this is very important that, again, when we look at manifest destiny, becoming very much in vogue in the 1830s and beyond, 1840s, 1850s, and, throughout that century, that when Americans were moving into the West, they felt that they were moving into this unknown territory that was not developed and not civilized. So they were, in a certain sense, they were bringing civilization again to this area, and they were going to transform nature. Nature existed in the wild. It was raw, if you will, but that they were moving westward to transform the landscape, to transform nature herself and everything that was in it, and actually turn it into something else, into something that they considered as civilization, modern civilization. We're going to bring modernity in this area. We're going to civilize it. We're going to develop this. Again, we're going to create enterprises. It's going to, again, be civilized fully. So this is the mission that I'm referring at, that, that they felt that God had given them particularly that mission, again, to move into those unknown, uncharted lands and pretty much transform everything into something new, okay, called civilization, if you will. So again, manifest destiny, extremely important concept in this understanding of the frontier, of how Americans see themselves, particularly in the 1800s, moving into the frontier, and how those religious ideas are going to play a key role, by the way, in shaping how Americans see this process, how they see themselves again in this process of moving into the frontier. All right, so I mentioned just a moment ago how Manifest Destiny was this great inspirational force moving people over into the West in the 19th century, the 1800s. But it is very important to note that the frontier closed also very rapidly in this century because particularly because there were millions of people also moving there for other reasons, if you will, that were outside of the realm of religion. They were more economic, again, in origin. That is, they were looking for land in order to own their own farm. And in the process, those farms are going to be run as enterprises. So there was a great motivation, if you will. The people that were moving into the frontier actually got land grants under the Homestead Act. Okay. And there were at least 600,000 families that were given land grants, 160 acres of land to move west. So yes, it is. There's also this practical matter that this is the land of opportunity. There's plenty of land, and we're gonna go there and develop it. Of course, it's gonna take a lot of work, if you will, but the land was almost like a giveaway, if you will. They're giving the land to you, and the idea is, look, back in the eastern states, there's no more land. Okay, so people had aspirations of owning their own land, having their own businesses, particularly a farm. And again, this actually was a great incentive, a great motivator for actually having people to rush to the west. So this created a land rush, if you will, by opening the gates through the so-called Homestead Act of 1862. People that did not have land, that aspired to own it, suddenly just left. They left their communities, they left their friends, their towns and cities that in which they were born, and they just left to the west to start a whole new life. So it is true. One of the reasons why in the 1800s the frontier is also going to close very rapidly is because, again, the gates were just wide open for people to pour in and own land. Okay, so we're going to see, of course, a massive outpouring of people moving into the Great Plains region, particularly, and they're now developing that region that was undeveloped in the past. So this is a very critical factor. I mentioned also the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The first transcontinental rail line was finished in 1867 that connected the East Coast and the West Coast. Okay, it was the first line, of course, and there were already other railroads that were, advancing also their rail lines as well to move all the way to the west. The Pacific Railroads, as they were called. So this also facilitated, if you will, the movements of populations, the movements of people, investors, merchants, pioneers, adventurers, families, if you will, that wanted to move to the west, and they could just board a train, pretty much move over to those territories and develop them, And so the railroad itself accelerated the closing of the frontier, if you will, because now we got modern transportation. Okay. And also, in 1890, there's yet another factor that contributed to the closing of the frontier, and that is the coming of the Indian reservation we talked about at the end of the second topic when we're talking about the Wild West. The Wild West. So, the Indian reservation is critical for closing the frontier because the Native American groups that lived in the so-called Wild West, uh, about 40 Indian nations, most of them were hunters and gatherers. Okay, so there were people that were moving around, chasing buffaloes and so on and so forth, hunting the buffalo. And so that factor was one of the issues that prevented many from actually moving forward into this region in the past. The fact that, again, there were hunters and gatherers that I don't want to move there with my family because I might have, a conflict with them again. So this is a territory that was not just undeveloped in the sense that there's no enterprises or there's just nature in the raw, but also, again, that is inhabited, if you will, by groups that might claim or reclaim their territorial domain again through some form of conflict, and people wanted to avoid that conflict, of course. So the coming of the reservation kind of took care of that issue because now those Native American groups are moving into an area where they're going to create communities. So instead of being, again, roaming around, hunting and gathering and chasing buffaloes and, etc. So instead of that, they're going to create their own sedentary communities. They're going to develop farming economies, if you will. And so that kind of eased, the anxieties that people had in the past of having any confrontations again with the Native American groups. So the coming of the reservation itself was yet another factor that allowed for the closing of the frontier because now all of those lands that were previously occupied by those Native American groups will be now open for settlement, and of course they're going to be settled, of course. So this is extremely important again, how by 1890, particularly by 1890, the frontier was declared officially closed in the United States, meaning that there's no longer a frontier because Americans had already reached all the way to the West Coast and have settled all of the lands, all of the territories that were previously unsettled and undeveloped, particularly after the end of the Civil War. Again, still, vast regions again of the West were pretty much unsettled and undeveloped, but now they are. By 1890, again, the all of that territory is already being pretty much settled. Okay, there's settlements, there's farmers, there's mining companies, there's agricultural companies, there's cattle ranches, all across those territories. Okay, so again, Americans kind of closed the frontier. They have reached all the way to the coast, to the West Coast. Okay, all of that from coast to coast, this process of settlement and moving to the west and crossing the frontier that started out back in the colonial period has now come to a close once again by 1890. So again, by 1890, it's totally closed. Okay. So at any rate, so once again, this is important because this announcement, it was actually given as an announcement that the frontier was officially closed. It was an official announcement in the United States by governmental officials saying, we hereby declare the frontier to be closed. There's no more land to the west because we have reached the Pacific Ocean. So therefore, this came as a great celebration in many cases that, well, this process of migrations that started out in the 1600s, that again, there was always the experience of migration in American history. This is over. By 1890, migrations are over. This doesn't mean that people are not going to be, of course, moving from one state to another, or that there's relocation, etc. Yes, there's going to be relocation, but now everything is taking place within the country itself that is already all settled. In other words, you might change maybe jobs from one state to another, but that's not really a migration per se. What I was referring as previously is migrations into lands that were undeveloped, if you will, that existed outside of the mainstream society, mainstream civilization, that is to say. So this came with a great celebration, if you will, okay? And that pushed academics, particularly academics in the United States, to, offer conferences and lectures, and some of them are going to be writing papers to try to explain the closing of the frontier and the meaning. What does it mean? Okay, the closing of the frontier. Does that mean this is the end of an era and the beginning of a new era, and what the new era is going to look like, and so on? So what can we learn from this process, that was just closed in 1890, called the frontier? It's closed. What can we learn from that? Again, so there were, of course, academic conferences, academic papers all over the country talking about that, but there was particularly one historian that stood out because he really presented a very comprehensive analysis of the significance of the frontier in American history. And he actually wrote a paper on that and presented conferences and so on. And he's now very well known today for actually establishing what is called the frontier thesis. In other words, this is a thesis about the frontier in which he is explaining in a very comprehensive way the significance of the frontier in American history. Okay, so Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, that actually in 1890, by the way, it is in 1890 precisely when he's going to publish his thesis, and there will be several conferences that in which he was presenting that that thesis. And that is, again, there's certain key points of his thesis that I would just like to elaborate and highlight here that are significant for understanding, of course, our topic is called In Search of New Frontiers, that is to say. So what Frederick Jackson Turner suggested in this paper, in this thesis, is that, of course, he's a U.S. historian. He's very well versed in American history, going back to the colonial period, etc. So what he's actually suggesting here about the closing of the frontier and the significance of the frontier in American history is that what he's proposing is that the frontier, this boundary that I've been referring at, as in the beginning of this session, that existed between the settlements of the East, settled by Europeans and later on by Americans, and of course the lands of the West that were unsettled. What the frontier did in American history is shape the American character. Okay, so what does this mean? Okay, so what he's actually saying here is that the experience of settlers coming from Europe, the English settlers coming to New England or Virginia or Pennsylvania, etc., and moving into this uncharted, unknown territory, okay, in search for land, in search for opportunities, or they were simply adventurers and trying to just explore, if you will, the landscape and so on, that this was a common experience ever since the colonial period. This is something that Americans grew accustomed to, leave their societies, leave their communities, and go into this unknown land. Again, unknown territories. That this experience that continue on and on and on for decade after decade, century after century until 1890, shaped the character of Americans, in that Americans develop specific character traits, in other words, that are very, very distinct, very unique to the people living in the United States versus, let's say, people that live in Europe or in other countries. Okay, where if you want to compare, for example, the character of the people that live in Mexico versus the ones that live, let's say, in some Asian country like Japan, or the people that live in Europe, let's say in places like France or England and so on. Every country is different, and the people of those countries have certain character traits. This is not to say that all of the people that live in a country are the same and alike. No, but they do have something of some traits that distinguish them from people living in another country. That is to say, certain traits. That is to say, once again, we're not really lumping people together and saying, okay, so all the people of one country, all the people in the United States are exactly alike. All are the same. It's not true. Okay, we're individuals. We have an individual, character that is very distinct, very unique from others, and so on and so forth. Yes, but as a culture, if you will, okay, when you share, of course, a culture with, let's say, the members of your own society, and here in American society, we do have a culture that we all share certain values, we all share certain ideas, certain principles in common, just share them, in other words. So that means that we all have in common certain character traits that are different, distinct from the character traits of other nations, that is to say. So what Frederick Jackson Turner is saying here is that the frontier shape those character traits in the American population. That is to say, that Americans exhibit certain character traits that are very distinct. And what are those character traits is something called, let me write it here. He called them rugged individualism, and the other character trait is self-reliance. Okay, self-reliance. Okay, so what does that mean? That what the frontier actually did is that this experience of people moving into the frontier made people very individualistic. In other words, that people realized that in order to prosper and to seek new opportunities, that you really needed to take individual responsibility for your own progress, for your own well-being. And in many cases, you had to leave your own family, you had to leave your loved ones, and in search for those individual aspirations, those individual opportunities, again, that people were looking, again, for their own individual needs, and they needed to pretty much step into the unknown in order to search for them. Okay. So this is, again, something that has to be understood by perhaps doing some compare and contrast, of course, of analysis of how other communities, for example, do work, or how they survive, or how they prosper. Because in other societies, this is something I already mentioned in previous topics, of course, is that in other societies, people function as groups and families, for example. There is the attachment to the family, and people work together as a family unit. And in order to make the family, of course, prosper, everybody, contributes, everybody works together. They're, pretty much functioning as a single enterprise. Okay. And it's very difficult for those societies, for the individuals living in those types of societies, again, to leave their families. Leaving the family is a very traumatic experience. We can see that in other cultures, in other societies, that whenever a member of the family has to leave, again, the family, because they need to go work or study, sometimes they go through homesickness, and it's so severe that they have to come back, okay, to the family, because they just cannot live without the family. It's, the emotional attachments to the family, the way they were raised as, being very connected, being very, very attached, if you will, to the family. That prevents that individual from taking that individual, if you will, step and say, well, I'm going to look out for my own individual needs. Yes, I'm a member of the family. I was raised there. I love them, but I'm an individual, so I need to develop myself, and I have to move. I have to move out. I need to search, for my own needs, look out for my own needs, and look out for my own future. So they step out again and search for those particular needs and opportunities elsewhere. Okay, so for a lot of societies, that's very difficult to do, because they're very community oriented. They're family based as well. The family is the most important thing, again, in life. Without the family, nothing matters. In reality, nothing can actually be preserved. So this is very distinct. What Frederick Jackson Turner says is that Americans, because of the frontier, they became very individualistic. They had to, in order to survive, because staying back home when there was no opportunities, when there was a lack of land, there was a lack of jobs, and it was overcrowdedness, people realized that was not going to help, of course, the community or the individuals prosper. So those were sacrifices that people needed to do. In other words, they needed to actually move into the frontier in search for their own development and to create their own opportunities, that is to say. So rugged, that's what called rugged individualism. That this shaped the character, again, of Americans. The frontier is that decade after decade, century after century of doing that, this shaped the way, the personality traits, the character traits of Americans, that we're very individualistic. So again, Americans, whenever, again, what Frederick Jackson Turner says, that what the frontier did was that whenever there was a lack of opportunity, or because opportunities were not present in the town or city where people lived, that made, of course, Americans actually see migration, moving to another area, as a necessity and part of life. Now, I'm just going to move out. Yeah, I'm going to leave my family, of course, but that's how life is. This is how life works. And again, this character trait was shaped by the frontier. Okay, this is what Frederick Jackson Turner said. It is that experience shapes character. The kind of experiences that people have are going to shape the way people actually are going to behave and see the world. And to make a comparison, of course, when we're talking about families and communities, for example, when you look at Europe, Okay, whether you look at Italy, for example, or France, people in Europe and France have been accustomed for many, many centuries to be born in the same town that they grow, that they develop, that they marry, and that they grow old, and ultimately the town in which they're going to actually leave this world. That is to say, so in many cases, they don't even leave the house of their families because, again, the experience of France and Italy was not one of movement like the United States. The United States was born in movement. That is to say, moving, the settlers arriving to the Eastern Seaboard and gradually and slowly but surely moving every year, every decade, every century to the West. So this constant movement made Americans very individualistic. Whereas in other countries, let's say Italy or France, for example, there's nowhere to go. The towns are already settled. The cities are already pretty much settled. The territory is very much constricted. Those are not countries that are moving and expanding territorially over time. So because there's nowhere to go, the experience is, I was born in the same house that are probably going to die. In other words, it's just part of life, in other words. So that's why, people were very much connected and attached to their families again in those societies in Europe. And the same holds true, of course, in other countries. And also self-reliance. Again, self-reliance is that because Americans were moving into the frontier on their own, they faced enormous challenges. Okay, as they move into the frontier, they had to do everything by themselves. Okay, they realized that they had to be very diligent, very disciplined as they crossed into uncharted territory and actually do all the work themselves. Whether they needed to walk, whether they needed to rest, whether they arrived to an area and needed to actually clear the land, they needed to do the work themselves, rely on themselves for all the work that needed to be done, as opposed to relying on others. That is to say, this is what Frederick Jackson Turner is saying, that over time, because of this self-reliance experience, the experience of trying to rely on yourself, that this also molded and shaped the American character as well. Okay, so again, he's pretty much doing a kind of psychological analysis of how this experience with the frontier is going to shape the American psyche, how Americans actually think, what makes them tick, their character traits, their personality traits. And again, he's pretty much presenting that in this paper. Now, the other, of course, is that what Frederick Jackson Turner is also saying here is that what also the frontier did in American history is provide Americans new opportunities like free land, again, in the West, which this free land that they obtained as they crossed the frontier helped maintain prosperity and freedom. In other words, that there was a sense that the United States was always prospering. Ever since the 1600s, moving forward, there was a sense that there's prosperity taking place. Right? This is not to say that this was the ideal existence in which everybody was experiencing prosperity. Okay, so we're not saying that, but the sense was that if you wanted prosperity, move west. That's where the prosperity is. Maybe not in the east side of the continent, in the eastern seaboard, because all the opportunities, all the land has already been pretty much exhausted. But if you want to prosper, just move westward. So this gave Americans that, if you want to prosper, you have to move. Okay, you have to go to the frontier. That's where prosperity is. And also, this is the place where freedom is as well. So Americans also developed the idea that, again, freedom was sacred. Why is it, again, that things like freedom, democracy, liberty became so sacred in the United States? And the reason for that, what Frederick Jackson Turner is saying is that because when people were moving into the Western territories, crossing the frontier, they were on their own and they were self-governing their own lives, whether they're creating a farm or they're living in a farming community, a farming settlement of farmers and so on and so forth. In many cases, those territories were outside the law, so to speak. There has not yet been, legal systems to speak of, moving into those towns. So people had to make choices. People have to come together and democratically speaking, pretty much decide what needed to be done. Okay, democratically speaking, meaning, well, farmers are going to get together, they're going to discuss a problem, and they're going to raise their hand whether they want to do this or that. Again, so that gave the sense that they were on their own and that they were pretty much governing their own affairs. Okay, governing their own communities, governing, their own enterprises as well. So this is where the idea of democracy is going to actually flourish. What Frederick Jackson Turner says, that the idea of democracy was born in the frontier. Okay, people moving there and pretty much making decisions on their own, how they were going to organize, what kind of system they were going to implement, what kind of rules, were important. Again, so all that was part of the frontier. Okay, the idea of freedom, that freedom was in the West, in other words. So this is yet another, of course, issue that he raises, the significance of the frontier in American history. And also, and it's very most important here for our discussion here, is that the frontier also shaped Americans in the sense that they always grew accustomed that there was a frontier, because there was always one. So there was always a dividing line between civilization, the lands that were settled versus those that were not. There was always, a kind of dividing world that they could cross, and, the opportunities, the freedom, and the democracy will be there to be created, to be developed. So by 1890, when the frontier is going to close, in 1890. What Frederick Jackson Turner is saying is that this idea of the frontier is not going to disappear from people's minds because it was always there. They're simply going to now search for that frontier abroad, that is to say, looking for new frontiers, that is to say. Okay, maybe there are lands or regions that we can develop. In other words, maybe there's opportunities elsewhere as well. We can actually, introduce civilization, American values and so on and so forth. And so they're simply going to now extend the frontier, even though it was already exhausted in the United States by 1890, because, they pretty much arrived to the Pacific Ocean. But nonetheless, they're actually going to push it, if you will, to the outside. At least they are going to imagine again that maybe the opportunities are present elsewhere, so we're looking for new frontiers, that is to say. Extremely important as how, again, the experience of the frontier is going to shape, of course, the future of the United States. And of course, what Frederick Jackson Turner is saying is that moving forward, moving after 1890, he sees that this is how the United States is going to be known. People that are shaped by the experience of the frontier, for centuries, the rugged individualism, the self-reliance, for example, the concept of prosperity and freedom existing in the frontier, maybe abroad, and of course, is now seeking new frontiers moving forward. Of course, this is important for looking at the 20th century, particularly the 20th century. All right. All right. So now that we have covered this first aspect of this topic, that we're just looking at the 19th century, the frontier closing in 1890, the factors that contributed to the closing of the frontier. We mentioned the Manifest Destiny, the Transcontinental Railroad, the Homestead Act, the coming of the Indian Reservation, and how Frederick Jackson Turner by 1890 is actually providing an analysis of how the frontier actually shaped the American character, the ideas of freedom, democracy, for example, prosperity, and so on. Now we move into this second aspect of this topic, okay, that is going to look at how after 1890 or thereabouts, how Americans in this case are going to start looking outwards, and in which ways they're going to project themselves into the outside world, particularly when there were commercial opportunities presented in places like Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Okay, so it is important to now start looking outside, how Americans are beginning to look at the outside world, of course, and how they're going to see themselves, of course, in relationship to that outside world. Okay, so I labeled this second part expanding the frontiers for Western civilization. Okay, so what I mean about this is that by the late 19th century, and as we move into the 20th century, Americans are looking for new frontiers because they're closed already here at home. But as people are beginning to see themselves moving outward, one of the things that they interpret about what was necessary, okay, as they're now trying to move outward, is that they're going to carry with them certain values that they're going to bring to the world, that is to say. And those values, if you will, those ideas were ideas that were particularly ideas that came out of what is called Western civilization. Western civilization, in a nutshell, is European civilization and North American civilization, by the way. So it's important that there was this perspective, this idea that as people are moving outward, they're going to take Western civilizations into other places of the globe, like Latin America to the south, the Latin American countries like Mexico, for example, Central America, the Caribbean islands, again, South America, but also places like Africa and also places like Asia as well, spreading, the ideas of Western civilization, that is to say. And in particular, what this implied is that if we want to be more specific, okay, so which specific ideas of Western civilization were Americans at this point thinking about expanding or spreading, is the ideas of modernity, okay, modernization in particular, again, more than any other idea. Now that other European ideas are not important here, but what was really in their minds is that, well, we're modernizing, okay? We're transforming our economies, we're industrializing, we're now, developing technologies like electricity, modern medicine, and the like, So the benefits of this modern economy, this modern industry, can be spread around the world. We can modernize other societies. So as Americans are beginning to move outwards, what was in their mind is that, well, maybe we can spread modernity around the world, modernize the globe. In other words, what we have accomplished so far the Industrial Revolution, for example, factories, railroads, and so on, telegraphs, telephones, electricity, a growing middle class, modern medicine and the like, that those benefits, can be also extended elsewhere. You know, Modernity cannot or should not just remain constricted in a handful of countries, but rather that we can actually help other countries modernize. Okay, better put, because they're still undeveloped. There's a lot of countries that have not developed railroads, nor industries, nor commercial enterprises. Okay, much less a middle class. Again, there's still, not had yet developed, of course, something called the middle class. They're not using modern medicine. In other words, they're still using traditional methods for curing disease, etc., based on magic and so on. So maybe we can, spread modern medicine. Maybe we can spread industries and, etc., all around the world. That, again, is what I'm referring as Western civilization here. Particularly when we talk about Western civilization, what they're referring to is the spreading of modernity in places like Asia, Africa, and particularly in Latin America. That was the closest, of course, region to the United States, to the south. Something that we can actually see in this topic much further down the road. So again, now before I actually just explain, of course, exactly what we mean, of course, by spreading modernity, I would like to kind of just remind you that this idea that was developed not only in the United States, but also in the modern nations of Europe, because the United States is not going to be the only nation that, where people feel, again, the impulse to spread the benefits of modernity around the world, but also Europeans, that is to say. Okay, even Europeans, we're talking about British, French, Dutch, and Germans, particularly, again, the Germans, the French, the Dutch, and the British, who are also industrializing and they're modernizing rather quickly. What we see is that by the latter part of the 19th century, that those European societies I mentioned and Americans feel that they're on a mission to now go all over the world and spread the benefits of modernity, modernize, all of the peoples of the world. Okay, Africa, Asia, Latin America, etc. So they feel that there's this mission. But this has not always been like this, This has not always been the views, if you will, of the Europeans towards the world. Because by the latter part of the 19th century, one of the reasons why Europeans and Americans feel this way is because they look at their own accomplishments, at their own developments, whether it's called modern technology, modern science, industries, as really signs of progress. This is something I already covered. Okay, signs that they were the ones actually at the very forefront of the frontiers of knowledge. Of course, that they were very advanced. In other words, like, look, we're very advanced because we have industries, factories, and everything else. Look at all these accomplishments. So this is a sign of progress. We have attained a lot of progress, in other words. So they began to look at other cultures as lagging behind in this progress because they were still using traditional methods of production. They were still using animals for agriculture instead of tractors. They were still praying to the rain gods to bring rain instead of irrigation systems and the like. Everything was done by hand as opposed to be done by machines in factories. So they saw other traditional cultures as
lagging behind. So they wanted, in a certain sense, to help them, develop, help them attain that progress. So this is important because in the past that was not so. When you look at the European views towards the world, let's say from the 1500s to the 1700s, as a matter of fact, when Europeans were actually moving outside of Europe, going to places like India, they were reaching Asia, China, they were moving into the west coast of Africa, and they were colonizing America. In many cases, okay, not all, but in many cases, the views of the Europeans towards the world, towards all of the other cultures and societies that they encounter, was one of simply distinct, different cultures that in many cases offer exotic, elements, exotic ideas, whether there was religious ideas, scientific ideas. In many cases, the Europeans were amused by the accomplishments of other cultures in architecture, in dress styles, and etc. Calendars, the counting of time, and so on and so forth. That in many cases, the Europeans were adopting many of those views. Okay, between the 1500s and 1700s, and in many cases, the Europeans were actually going native. Intermarrying, in many cases, with the local populations they encounter, whether the Spaniards were doing that in places like the New World, Mexico, Central and South America, or whether the French were also intermarrying the local native population in Eastern Canada, for example, or the British were also intermarrying with the peoples of India. They colonized India, the British, in the late 1600s, and they were also intermarrying in many cases with the local population. So they were going native, if you will. The cultures became very hybrid because there was a lot of mixing and blending and borrowing between the Europeans and other societies. So this is, again, a process that existed prior to the Industrial Revolution, by the way. That this is how the Europeans were interacting and viewing, in many cases, the cultures of the world. But by the 1800s, those views, of course, began to change as a result of this modern science, technology that I just explained, the Industrial Revolution, and so on. So that, again, changed the views of the Europeans, in that Europeans began to see now themselves as making a leap forward, if you will, in knowledge, particularly in systems of knowledge, that they were now developing a science that was enable them to really unlock the mysteries of creation and the universe, and that they were creating miracles with it. Okay, the miracles of technology, in other words. And so that gave those European groups the sense that they, again, we're advancing farther to a new realm, if you will, a new ideal world, a new ideal existence, that this was the ideal existence that other societies needed to also catch up to, in other words, okay, that they were really creating a civilization that indeed was the kind of civilization that should exist everywhere else. In other words, it's called Eurocentrism. In other words, what Eurocentrism is that the view that Europeans began to look at other cultures through their own lens, meaning that, well, this is the way people should live. They should have, industrialization. They should industrialize. They should have machinery. They should have all of those technologies that we have. And those that don't have that, again, they need to catch up. In other words, that this is the ideal existence. This is the way human beings on Earth need to live. So that's what Eurocentrism is that pretty much viewing the world through your own and kind of, projecting your own values again on others, if you will. So what this meant is that people, again, in Europe, in those industrialized countries, but also in the in North America, in the United States, developed the notion that they are now on a mission, therefore, because now they're convinced that those benefits, again, that they are now attaining, they're receiving from all those accomplishments, from having a modern industrial economy and society and technology, that they need to actually spread them all over the world. And they feel that this was a religious mission. It was not just a mission, but that God has actually gave the European world and North Americans, again, the mission to spread, of course, modern civilization across the planet. This was best expressed by a poem written by a British poet by the name of Rudyard Kipling, a poem that he titled "The White Man's Burden." Well, that man, of course, he's expressing there is, the sentiments, if you will, of the modern industrial countries, in that they feel that they have been given a mission, a religious mission by God, to spread modernity all over the world. And this was like a burden, because what that meant is that there will be great sacrifices being done. To accomplish that, people will have to leave their places of origin, their countries, their families behind, to go into unknown lands, for example, like Africa, for example, or Asia or Latin America, and actually undergo ordeals, challenges, trials there as they're trying to spread modernity into those regions. It's not going to be an easy thing, that is to say. It's a burden, that is to say. So again, there was the sense that the industrialized societies of the world felt that we should also spread this kind of civilization elsewhere. Okay, this is the mission. Okay, what you call European Western civilization, that is to say. Okay, let me check the time. I roughly have about 3 minutes. So again, I'm actually going to stop here. I mean, we do have another 3 minutes. I'll probably just, mention that there was yet another aspect again of this expansion of Western civilization, is that it's not just the mission to spread modernity. There was also the sense that the Americans felt, as well as the Europeans, is that the mission was not just to spread modernity in terms of spreading factories and railroads and modern medicine and technology around the world, but also to spread Christianity as well. The sentiment back in those days was that there's also the need to send missionaries, okay, around the world to spread Christianity in every corner of the globe. That is to say, okay, that's another aspect of what we call Western civilization. Again, is that it's not just modernity; it's also the religion, the predominant religion, whether it's Christianity in terms of Catholicism or Protestantism. There's so many branches of Protestantism, but the idea is, whether we're talking about those Protestant denominations or Catholicism, is that doesn't matter, because you're going to be spreading Christianity all over the world, convert the peoples of the world, in other words, so they can become Christian. So, some of the issues, of course, that led to this was, again, prophetic ideas that were very much present during this time concerning the second coming of Christ. This is called Christian millenarianism. All of the Christian prophecies that talk about the second coming of Christ are referred as Christian millenarian ideas, Christian millenarianism. Again, the idea that Christians anticipate the second coming of Christ to happen anytime soon. So in order to prepare people, it is important, therefore, to spread Christianity all over the planet, all over the globe, that is to say, to prepare the world for the second coming. So this is something was very, very present in the United States. And there were preachers, of course, that in their services during Sundays They were actually talking about this at the turn of the century. One of the most important ones was Joshua Strong, who was one of the leaders of this millenarian movement at the turn of the century, the second coming of Christ. He was one of the founders of the social gospel movement, the using of the gospel, the using of Christianity to reform society. Again, sending missionaries, in other words, to different areas of the United States, but also to send missionaries to different areas of the world in order to spread the gospel, the teachings of Christ, in other words, to spread them. And through that, actually, help other societies make the transition towards modernity as well. Okay. Help them how to work, how to become more, industrious, more disciplined in how they actually conduct what is work, considered to be work, etc. Help to build, schools, hospitals, for example. The missionaries are going to be there, of course, helping people actually, again, become more educated, teaching them how to read, write, take medicine to those societies, to expand the lifespan and so on and so forth. Again, so this is the age of the Protestant missionaries, as it was called, because there were millions of missionaries going to places like China. They were going to places like Africa. They were going to places like Latin America by the millions, all over, building missions and spreading the gospel, spreading Christianity, again, in those societies, and trying to spread the religion, by the way, in preparation for what they believe is the second coming of Christ, but at the same time, preparing peoples for the arrival of modernity, to live in a modern civilization, that is to say. Okay. So again, there's going to be New England missionaries, many of them going to Hawaii, and in Hawaii, of course, in the latter part of the 19th century, they're also going to be engaged in building schools and building hospitals and spreading Christianity in this region. Okay. So this is all I have for you. When we come back, I'm going to actually review, of course, this particular point. The mission to spread Christianity is going to be re-explained more fully in the beginning of session 2, and we're going to actually move forward from this onwards, continuing the other, aspects of In Search of New Frontiers. But that's all I have for you as for now. I'll upload this video, and then by next week, I'll be uploading session 2 and session 3, and by next week. Thank you.